We are, as we're recording this, experiencing the global pandemic of COVID-19. And for some people, this is their first experience with a disrupted supply chain. In fact, the word supply chain, inventory management, drop shipping have become part of our daily conversation. We talk about how we expected a pandemic or something of this magnitude to be dramatic in fashion, and yet what most people are facing are empty shelves and the scarcity of everyday items like soap and, famously, toilet paper.
Yeah, I mean, what are the stories behind the barcodes and boxes, and how are supply and demand impacted by tariffs and freight? How do businesses offer sustainability with their services and products? And, we are on a fast learning curve to help us navigate this topic. So we've invited two experts to the Afterword table.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
Dr. Mark Ferguson is a Distinguished Business Foundation Fellow and Professor of Management Science at the Moore School at the University of South Carolina. So welcome. Mark, tell us a little bit about what you are working on right now and some of your interests.
Well, thanks, Amy. I'm the department chair of what's called the Management Science Department at the Business School at University of South Carolina. And our major from our department is operations and supply chain. So we deal with all kind of issues of getting products from point A to point B, sourcing, manufacturing, using data to help make better decisions, all sorts of fun stuff like that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Joining Mark is Scott Luton, the founder and CEO of Supply Chain Now, and his extensive real-life experience brings best practices into the supply chain spotlight. So, Scott, tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now.
Thanks so much, Holland and Amy. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Ferguson, who's at one of the leading business schools in the country, if not the world. So it's an honor to be here. So right now, our Supply Chain Now team is focused on delivering a couple things, really. We're answering the huge demand that exists for timely information, of course, related to COVID-19, the environment, the challenging landscape we're all getting through, whether you're a global supply chain or a professional or just a consumer. How leaders and companies across the global supply chain are navigating these challenging times is in demand. Business leaders, supply chain professionals are looking for good information and accurate information, as well as what other companies are doing to break through. Additionally, our listeners rely on Supply Chain Now to consistently deliver real stories from real people that offer proven best practices and insights. We're all after that, right? This is the type of content that will elevate their supply chain IQ really for any environment that we face. We've been asked a lot, how are we adapting our content delivery and production schedule? Really, we see this a kind of a digital twin. We're trying to ramp up our very timely and relevant COVID-19, super relevant in the moment content, right? Insights, best practices, while still serving folks that are taking this moment to make themselves better professionals and better leaders. So we've never been busier publishing podcasts, live streams, and webinars to serve that need that we have heard about in the marketplace.
That's fascinating. And what's very interesting is Holland and I had you and Mark on the docket way before we knew about COVID-19. When we knew this was coming up, Holland and I didn't try to get giddy, but we're like, wow, how did we nail this one? We had no idea that this was going to be such a hot macro trend.
I thought you might have had some kind of highly sophisticated forecasting algorithm that just happened to work out.
Yeah,
I
Holland,
really wish that were the case.
I know. It might be divine inspiration. I don't know. We are so excited to have you guys on the podcast. And you're using some words, both of you, that are very interesting to me. And again, this is the future, the conversation about the future of words. So as we get going into my next question about how you got into your field, Mark, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what was the draw? Why did you want to get into this field?
Sure. So my bachelor's degree was actually in mechanical engineering. and that's where you're learning to design, new products and test the strength of, a bar, for example, and make sure it'll hold a force and that kind of thing. So it's heavy math focused. My first kind of professional full-time job was with IBM in Charlotte, North Carolina, back when they used to make things. They had a card assembly plant there, and it was a huge plant. They would build the circuit boards that went into the computers and the mainframes and everything. And my job was a new process development engineer. So I would be down on the floor, kind of trying to make a new piece of equipment work or figure out how to tweak the performance to maybe get a 1 or 2% improvement in the throughput or the quality level or something like that. And I spent a lot of time, down there, and there was about 12 different assembly lines set up. It was such a huge plant. And I would notice, just if I walked down at any random time, only about half of those lines would actually be working and building things. And the other half would just be sitting there, and workers would be there, and the equipment would be there, but no product would be going through, which I always thought was a little weird. And, being a young, naive, I guess probably overly brash employee, I started asking questions like, how do we make money this way? This is stupid. Why do we have all this equipment and people and we are not making things? It seems like a dumb way to run the business.
I bet they love that.
Oh, yes. That made me really popular. And I guess they finally got fed up with me, and they moved me, or I guess suggested that I take on a new role of trying to manage the inventory for the plant and try to procure parts. And that taught me why all those lines were sitting empty, was that oftentimes we didn't have all the parts. It only takes one missing, and out of 5,000 different components that might go on that product, and you can't start that job. So I realized very quickly the challenges that supply chain managers face, but I also realized that that's really where the true biggest bang for the buck was. I could tweak out a 1 or 2% improvement working on our processes, but 80% of our cost of goods was actually in what we procured. So, a small improvement in your supply chains has a big impact on your bottom line.
Wow, that's fascinating. And it's interesting that you were able to see both sides of the coin.
Yes, but belatedly. What it really taught me, I think, taking on that job was I didn't really know too much about supply chain management. So I did my best for a few years and eventually went back and got a PhD in it.
Very good. Very good. How about you, Scott? What's the draw? What brought you into this field?
Sure. So I got out of the United States Air Force in 2002, where I served as a data analyst. And instead of course, doing the smart thing and riding the early part of the big data wave, I went the other direction. And I mean, frankly, I really struggled with my transition, getting back into the private sector. I ended up in a sales role, which eventually led to a role at a privately held manufacturer in Columbia, South Carolina, of all places. And fell in love with it right away. And that is what started about 15, 16, 17 years, what have you, either in manufacturing or in supply chain or supporting it. And, the production environment, the camaraderie, the problem solving, the continuous improvement, you're always looking for, how to avoid the same problems oftentimes. Of course, the technology, even back then, we had some technology in supply chain. And of course, how everyone came together to take care of the customer. I'd argue that most of all of that still exists in large forms in the supply chain industry today, of course, with a lot more technology. And I still love all those elements. And much more importantly, it's incredibly rewarding to get up each day and share these compelling stories from the world of supply chain to our global audience.
Okay, let's go ahead, since we're starting, and define a few particular words so that we all know what we're talking about. Supply chain. Scott, what is a supply chain?
One of my least favorite questions, but kidding aside, there's so many different definitions. And of course, as an industry, what people associate with the word supply chain has evolved a great deal, especially in the last 15, 20 years. And what's really also cool about thinking about the definition of supply chain is more and more consumers are learning more about what it means and what functions it contains and how important it is in all the conveniences that we all enjoy. So I really believe in the end-to-end and what I call back again supply chain approach. So the most simple way I've ever seen it be put is the supply chain operations reference model, which is also known as SCORE. We love our acronyms in supply chain. The SCORE framework is associated with the Global Association for Supply Chain Management, which I've been involved with for quite some time. And they put it like this: plan, source, make, deliver, return, enable. And those 6 words, there's always gaps, right, in any definition. But those 6 words, I believe, especially the first 5, really define what goes on in end-to-end and back again supply chain. And so that's the best definition I've come across.
That's a fantastic definition.
Yeah, I think it can be universally applied. I'm not as crazy around the enable, that 6 word, however, because it means so many different things. But, if you think about Sharpies, right, you've got to plan the whole shebang. Then you've got to source the raw materials, the plastics, the ink, the felt tips, all the things that make up some of our favorite pens. And then, of course, you got to make the pens. Maybe, there's a big plant in Tennessee where I believe is one of the biggest manufacturing sites where they make tons of Sharpies. Deliver the pens to consumers or retailers. You got to return to ones where I might have picked the wrong color, and my dear wife Amanda says you got to go back, or maybe wrong sizes. And then the enable, there's lots of different interpretations, but one of the things that I like there is enabling the continuous improvement and innovation that's got to take place up and down the end-to-end supply chain.
Okay, that's good. I had not thought of supply chains in that way. I just thought of them as like these little dots on a map, and that goods moved from dot to dot. That's as far as it ever went with me. All of that context that you just added really fleshes it out. There's another word that we hear a lot, Mark, when we talk about supply chains. And this word was really popular even before COVID-19, tariffs, right?
Right.
What's a tariff and why does it matter?
Well, first, thanks for asking Scott the tougher question, because I think...
I've got one that's not on the script that I just found the other day that's really going to be fun.
Okay. Looking forward to that. But tariffs are basically a tax on something that is imported. And they've been around forever. As long as civilization has been there's been tariffs. And at one point, actually a large part of our country's history, that was our government's primary form of revenue, was applying tariffs to imported goods. Now, we've kind of moved away from that. There's a lot of downsides of tariffs. One of many being that, there's kind of winners and losers with tariffs. So how do you choose what to put a tariff on? How much do you make that tariff? If you are not a big fan of, say, lobbyists having influence in government, then you probably don't like tariffs. Because whenever tariffs are discussed, that's like a gold mine for the lawyers and the lobbyists up there to make their case for their constituents or their, whoever they're representing. And actually, if you study kind of the history of our country pre-Civil War, that was actually a big debate, or one of the big clashing points between the northern states and the southern states, because the northern states had much more manufacturing. They were much more kind of self-sufficient, if you will, where the southern states, being more agriculturally focused, had to import a lot of their products and goods from overseas. So they felt like the tariffs really hurt them much more than the rest of the country.
That's very interesting. I never knew that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the background to some of these words. That gives some clarity. All right. So you've kind of hit a little bit about, and you mentioned it a little bit on sourcing and using data. So Mark, what are some of the success stories in supply chains? What's a success story that you could share?
Well, I'll start with the broader success story of supply chains in general. I mean, we see it every day up until about a month ago. I think what we're noticing now is when supply chains break down, but the fact that we never were talking about supply chains, the average person was not talking about supply chains, is a testament to just how well they were working. But if you really want kind of a amazing example of one that's been working for years, very close to most of us here, is the Bmw factory up in Greer, South Carolina. So one thing that's a little bit different with BMW's manufacturing process compared to, say, some of their more mass market competitors is in a given day, there's usually no two cars that are exactly the same coming off of their assembly lines. I think, one time they had something like 200,000 different configurations for the same model. And they pretty much make to order. So the customer can specify exactly what type of leather they want on their steering wheel or something like that. So to organize all of the different material and sub-assemblies and everything to come together just right at the right time to produce that very unique vehicle. And they're doing this in volume, and they've been doing it for years. I mean, this is the largest BMW factory in the world, and they export 60% of what they make to other countries. I think it's just a fascinating and one of my favorite plant tours to take.
It is a great plant tour, I have to say. If you've never, ever taken the BMW tour, it is fantastic. And I hadn't really thought about each one of those cars being unique, and I appreciate you bringing that up. That's an amazing point. So before we move to the failures, Scott, have you got a success story?
Absolutely. I love that phrase, and I love the fact that you don't have to go far to find thousands and thousands of success stories in the supply chain world. Of course, it is illegal, according to federal law, to have any supply chain conversation or even a business conversation these days without talking about the big A, right? Amazon. If you really boil it all the way down, Amazon is a big data-driven supply chain super competitor that has, of course, as we all know, revolutionized the world. It's given the consumers the expectations of wide selection at low cost, and on top of it, you get it within 2 days, soon to be 1 day, in some cases 2 hours. So, by the way, we're also going to make it really easy, in most cases, to return items and get your money back, which of course is a critical component of the Amazon effect. So that, in a big, wide, general sense, is a remarkable supply chain success story. And then if you fast forward to today and the global environment we face that we're working through together, no shortage of success stories and really good news. Big and small companies in a variety of segments or nodes, as Holland referred to earlier, of end-to-end supply chain that are all pivoting to help our country and other countries with healthcare supplies, other items. These are massive success stories that reflect the innovative, can-do part of the DNA that you find in the supply chain world. We got automotive companies making ventilators. We got breweries making hand sanitizer, and of course, getting them to wherever they need to go in short order. I find that to be absolutely remarkable and uplifting.
I could not agree with you more. I mean, those are the good news stories that we all need to hear. One of our guests last time we had Mary Catherine Kunze on, and she makes unique bags, kind of going back to what Mark was sharing about the BMW, each one coming off the line being unique. Well, she's now shifted gears and started making masks, and she cannot keep up with production. It's gone crazy. So, Scott, that's a really excellent point about the positivity. And also what you were saying, Mark, about the fact that we haven't had a dip in our supply chain and lack of toilet paper up to this point is a pretty big testament to the supply chain in our country. So those were excellent answers. So let's shift gears just a little bit because, we want to see the full picture. Scott, tell us one thing that might be a story that's kind of an oops, wish that hadn't happened.
Sure. I think for starters, there's going to be a ton of lessons learned for many years to come. I can see it from business schools to organizations to the Fortune 500 in terms of lessons learned from this, what we're dealing with now, especially, I believe, related to risk management and mitigation and those strategies. But on a much lighter note, right, because we're still getting a lot of data before we can really assemble too many key lessons learned. I think on a much lighter note, you never mess with the fried chicken supply chain. And a couple years back, KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken supply chains in the United Kingdom ran out of raw chicken. This is 2018. It shut down 900 stores. I don't know how long they were shut down, but just imagine 900 stores being shut down one day and think of the revenue and all the unhappy people that love fried chicken.
Yikes. We've had several guests from the UK, and I would imagine that there would be some crosswords with those people at KFC.
Undoubtedly.
How about you, Mark? Have you got a oops story for us?
Well, I could probably bring up one that probably most of us on this podcast remember is 2008. There was a fuel shortage for the Southeast. I was living in Atlanta at the time, which I think probably had the biggest disruption. But that was, if you remember, there was hurricanes that came through and they knocked out some refining facilities down in Louisiana, which was our primary supply. And there was about a week where you would drive around gas station after gas station and no one had any fuel. Or if they did, it was $8 a gallon and there was 20 cars, in line. So, I think we're kind of living through one now, but that's one that still sticks in my mind. I actually remember my wife getting up in the morning and seeing a gas truck and following it until it went to a station to refill because we were getting that worried about, not just having the fuel to take the kids to school or get to work.
Right. Oh, I definitely remember that. No one was planning trips, or if you did, you got stranded. Yeah, these are great examples. Thank you for sharing them.
The Possibilities Podcast. I had on a guest. His name was Eric Wilson. He's the Director of Thought Leadership at the Institute of Business Forecasting and Planning. And this is what he said with regard to
the current situation, COVID-19. There are people calling this a black swan. A black swan event is something that if you haven't seen one, you couldn't understand exactly what it's going to look like. This is something no one could plan for and understand exactly what it looked like. It doesn't mean you can't see the shadows of a black swan and prepare for it, but in most cases, it's something that blindsides everyone. Now planners have to deal with the current reality of what's coming, even when there are so many unanswered questions lurking around them. How, in terms of a supply chain, do you deal with black swan events and how do you prepare for them?
I could take the first stab at this if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good, Mark.
So I think he's absolutely right. I would call this a black swan. I mean, I know people have been warning about major scale epidemics for years, but people warn about a lot of things at any given time. So I'm not too hard on saying we should have been paying more attention. We should have, foreseen this. I'm sure we could do better. I'm sure we will do better for the next one. But these things just, it's always going to be something a little bit different that kind of takes you by surprise. And the best way is not to try to design your supply chains and your distribution networks and everything for a specific event, but for any event that can cause a disruption. So we don't know what's going to cause that disruption. We don't know exactly what form it's going to take place, but there is a way to build some resiliency into your supply chains, to play some what-if games, to maybe don't always chase after the absolute lowest price, but think through, scenarios where one particular sourcing option might be a little more expensive, but also a little more resilient. So I think hopefully that will be one lesson we take from this.
Yeah, Mark, I like your answer. And I'll say ditto what he said. I think, look, the current environment is as unheard of and unique as all the superlatives being thrown around about it. When we look at the food supply chain, you've got folks that have been in the food supply chain for 30 plus years saying that it is never before seen levels of demand. That is very difficult for even the most successful global supply chain teams to deal with. When Chinese manufacturing plants go down for 2 months, it's going to be next to impossible for that not to impact what's on some of our shelves, some of our products here in the States. So, but as Mark alluded to, a big part of any supply chain professional job description is problem solving. And despite how a lot of those job descriptions are there's a lot more technology, there's a lot more data analytics and a lot more communication skills and a lot of savvy, well-rounded traits that are why supply chain professions are competing for top talent against the likes of technology and other professional services and other businesses. But at the end of the day, you're solving problems. And with these black swan, if it's a black swan, I'll go with that. But we still have to define the problem, gather the data, and figure out the best countermeasures. And I tell you, that's where folks in supply chain are at their best. And we're seeing it in so many ways. What we're seeing in stores and across our communities could be so much worse. There's a lot of sharp people making a lot of decisions on the move, with still a ton of uncertainty out there in the marketplace. So anyway, that's what that makes me think of, at least.
Okay. So let's think about it then from outside the supply chain, and let's not think about those smart people. Let's think about all the rest of us. How do trends and customer intentions and customer influence, how do those things affect supply chains? I'm thinking of things like iPhones, Beanie Babies, Air Jordans, these things that suddenly become very, very popular and then die.
Well, Mark, I'll go first.
Yeah, sure.
And I would say that supply chains exist because of consumers. You can't say the word consumer without going a few more words before you say demand. You know, one of the most powerful forces in the universe is demand, which is driven by consumers. And that's such an important word, especially in today's landscape. It's important for folks to understand what we're talking about when it comes to demand. You know, a couple of examples, not that Mark can define this a lot better than I can, I'm sure, but a couple of examples I think are easy for any of us to understand, including me, who's amongst the slowest, thickest skulled. Seasonal demand. So think pumpkins during the fall, or think chicken wings during the Super Bowl. You know, supply chains work in overdrive on those types of items during those seasons. Holland, you mentioned iPhones. So let's talk about industry demand and company demand. You know, think smartphones. You know, in the U.S., we spent almost $78 billion on smartphones in 2019, which is actually down for the first time in years over 2018. Within that industry, there's a ton of company demand for two big brands, Samsung and Apple. So, of course, that consumer demand drives a lot of supply chain activity at those companies and their global supply chains. In fact, we've heard some reports of, for Apple in particular, the factories that were down and missed a lot of time and took some time to get back up in China after, 6, 12 weeks down or what have you. There may be some challenges getting your iPhone fixed and based on what's wrong with it. So back to your question, Holland, consumers influence supply chains virtually like no one else.
That's interesting. We don't really think about how much influence we have collectively. We tend to think of people putting stuff on the shelves for us and not people putting stuff on the shelves that we've demanded from them.
Well, Holland, if I may, there's one other really important element when I think of consumers, and I did not include it, is if you look at corporate social responsibility and sustainability, right? Consumers these days that have the bulk of the purchasing power, that is in demand. They are really voting with their dollar when it comes to the brands that they are electing to purchase. And they want to see those types of initiatives being led by a lot of the companies. They're making decisions based on that. They're looking for the triple bottom line, right? Companies that really view their enterprise that way. Of course, we're all familiar with the financial bottom line, but you also got to factor in more and more these days the social and environmental bottom line. And that's if we talk demand, I think that's also a really big, important way that consumers more and more are going to be impacting global supply chains.
What do you think, Mark?
So going to those examples you mentioned, maybe the iPhone when it first came out might have fit that category, but Beanie Babies and Air Jordans and things like that are kind of faddish, if you will. They take off kind of unexpectedly, and they have a fairly short, selling lifespan. Those are probably the most difficult type of products to plan for. And the reason being that companies are coming out with new products all the time. And consumer taste is hard to predict, especially in things like fashion and discretionary items like that. So, I think I've read that only roughly about 20% of products that are new products that are introduced would be deemed successful, if you will. And probably only 2% actually really take off, like those Beanie Babies, for a while, or Air Jordans or things similar. So this is where the supply chain, managers and people in the field kind of really earn their paychecks, right? Is you're not going to build up a massive amount of capacity and inventory for every new product that you put out there. You don't know which one's going to take off. Most companies are not very good at that. But when they do, now you're scrambling because you've only got a short window to kind of take advantage of that. And competitors are going to come in the market with knockoffs and everything. So it's really, time is critical. And you've really got to ramp up and, meet that unexpectedly high demand. So this is the sleepless nights of our profession, right? Where you're just trying to get capacity and components and sourcing from anywhere you can, because you only have a very small window to hit it.
Those are excellent reminders. I very much appreciate the percentages and some of the understanding of why something would take off and why it wouldn't. And Scott, the corporate responsibility and voting with your dollar and looking at the environment and that kind of thing. So those are just really good answers. And this whole black swan thing, this is new. This is absolutely new for most of us. This is something we've not heard of before. So I appreciate your insight. All right. So as we wrap up this first episode of Supply Chain, Scott, what is an essential element we need to understand surrounding supply chains, freight, tariffs, and distribution?
I think of three quick things. I think number one, it's critical that we right now in this environment, we take every single step that we can to keep our end-to-end supply chain workforce safe and healthy right this moment. I mean, as much as I admire all the brave healthcare workers out there that are on the front lines in this COVID-19 environment, we've got to keep them protected. Our end-to-end supply chain, our movers, makers, pickers, packers, drivers, managers, you name it, really important. We've got to keep them healthy and safety and protected. Secondly, I've always found it really fascinating, and hopefully the rest of the world that aren't familiar with supply chain will find this fascinating as we learn more about what supply chain does. As we know, there's an immense pressure right now on speed to delivery, and supply chain professionals are able to GSD, get stuff done on the scale that they are, really bridging all of the beautiful differences and languages that make up our world. Think about how many countries do not get along, but yet global supply chains find a way of bridging all the cultural differences and the problems that might come up, all to serve the customer. I think that's a beautiful story. And then thirdly, it takes talent. And what Dr. Mark Ferguson is doing, Steve Rudnicki, who is a big fan of Dr. Ferguson, and all these other educators and practitioners and how they engage the current generations and the next generations and opens up their eyes to what supply chain is and all the opportunities. That is something that we all have to know, because without talent, as much technology drives supply chain in many ways, it still takes great leaders, great problem solvers, and talented people. That's
fabulous. And coming as an educator, I could not agree with you more. And having that talent undergird that next generation. Man, that was a fantastic answer. What about you, Mark?
Well, I was going to say something different, but now I feel like I need to follow up on Scott's comment, because it really is. Like, I discovered supply chain kind of later. It was after I left college. And I still very, very rarely run into a high school student that has heard of, a job in supply chain management or logistics, or has any idea what it is. So we try to convert students kind of after they already come to our college, and say, hey, look at us over here. But it is a really fascinating career. And I would say, right up there with our heroes at this time, in terms of the medical professionals and everything that are saving lives. Without the equipment and without the medicines and everything, if we can't get it to them, they can't do their job. So I really couldn't agree more with Scott saying, these are also people on the front line. They're handling packages that have been touched by many, many people. They're putting their lives at risk, and they're doing it, to just keep the economy going and to keep the medical supply chain going, and keep us fed. So we really, really do owe them a great degree of appreciation and gratitude.
Well put.
Yeah, well put. I don't know about you, Holland. I feel like this is almost emotional. Like, this is such a beautiful, beautiful episode and very uplifting. I'm really encouraged.
Yeah, and I liked what you said. People don't usually sit around as children or teenagers or even college students and say, when I grow up, I'm going to get a job in supply chain management. That's like a sort of even relatively obscure specialization for an MBA. And yet we now see the absolutely critical nature of it. And, and there's just so many places in which it lays over other things. When we talk about national security, when we talk about trade, when we talk about, I don't know, there's so many pandemics, obviously, in public health. There's just so many places in which it intersects that we really don't think about. Okay, before I just fill up time talking, let me say thank you to Scott and Mark. This is a critical topic for the current global situation and beyond, right? Join us next week as we conclude our conversation with these brilliant guests. And don't forget to subscribe at theafterwordpodcast.com. Be part of the Afterword family. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And as always, you are welcome at our table.